Good evening, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff Lives. And tonight we're going to do one of my minefields. And when I do a minefields, that's basically me um, expounding upon some topic that's been in my mind lately. And tonight's topic is William Yandell Elliot and the Tennessee Templars. So So let's get into it. Hey, David. Hi, guys. Biomancer, All the Sun, and everybody else. Hello, Corky. Glad to have you with us. And Rick, ECAT. Hello, everybody. So this is kind of a big picture discussion tonight that I wanted to have. We talk about, and we've been doing a lot of work with Harley Schlanger on this of the LaRouche organization, and grateful to him for his historical insight. It's just amazing the sweep that he can cover in a sentence or two. So the idea is, here's the question posed: whose rules-based order? Well, what is this rules-based order that we hear of from the World Economic Forum, from the Atlantic Council, from Blinken, and the British aristocrats, Malik Brown, and the people that we're starting to get to know as players under the new world under Joe Biden? Are we in the new world order yet? We're kind of sort of got our toes wet anyway. I think we're starting. When Henry Kissinger puts on his purple, his royal purple suit jacket. And what does that tell you? I think he's saying, "Hey, man, game's over. We won. The empire wins." Um, just along the same thing, just brainstorming today, I'm seeing the this organization called the Guardians. Do you know who the Guardians are? Well, no, it's not the Guardians of the universe from whatever comic book that was. I don't know watch him, but at least I know there was such a thing. But what Guardians are we talking about? Well, the Guardians is this group of bankers and high-level executives of corporations centered around the idea that they are world because they are the guardians. Pope Francis is one of the guardians, and there's a picture of him with all of these high mucky mucks from Rockefeller and all the great corporations. And the whole theme of their website is in purple. So once again, I see this imperial purple starting to be more and more prominent in the sense that it's telling us, hey, we're the empire, and yeah, we're back, and you guys need to get in line. Patricia Liberos, thank you for joining us from Haiti. I wish you well in your country, people. Um, you're in our thoughts, of course. Robert, yes, Robert Kovac says the Fabians. Well, we're going to talk about the Fabians tonight, but yeah. So, the question posed that I wanted to try to address tonight, with the help of some studies around William Yandell Elliot, is where did what rules? Whose rules based order? Where did this come from? And you know, what makes you think we're going to agree to it? So I'm going to start with a quote of Tony Blair. Yes, our favorite labor leader from the Bush Empire, the George W. times, when they, had to kick off a war. And isn't it's still kind of odd that somebody on the labor side in Britain and somebody on the far right conservative side in America would join together with the idea that, hey, we've got to fight this war. We've got to go over there and invade the Middle East and invade Iraq. And why? Well, I want to read this quote from Tony Blair in 2004. And this is Tony Blair. Forgive me, I won't try any British accents. So for me, before September 11th, I was already reaching for a different philosophy in international relations from a traditional one that has held sway since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. We know now, if we didn't before, that our own self-interest is ultimately bound up with the fate of other nations. The doctrine of international community is no longer a vision of idealism. It is a practical recognition that just as within a country, citizens who are free, well-educated, and prosperous tend to be responsible, to feel solidarity with a society in which they have a stake, so do nations that are free, democratic, and benefiting from economic progress tend to be stable and solid partners in the advance of humankind. The best defense of our security lies in the spread of our values. But we cannot advance these values except within a framework that recognizes their universality. If it is a global threat, it needs a global response based on global rules. Okay, that's 2004, Tony Blair. Global threat, global response based on global rules. Okay. Treaty of Westphalia has been the principal agreement among countries that represents the order that came out of the 30 Years' War. And if you don't know the story, basically in the Holy Roman Empire, as it broke up and became, partly Protestant and partly Catholic, and they would, also have the Calvinists and all, but to simplify it, as at the end of 30 years of this bloody, merciless fighting, the principal people involved agreed on a deal that is called the Peace of Westphalia. And basically the deal is that if the Duke of this area gets to decide what the religion is in that area, the principal religion. And that means if you don't agree with that state religion, then you're going to lose, but you can always leave and go over to the state across the river there whose prince is a Protestant and says, my country is Protestant. So they had so many of these little countries in old Middle Europe, Germany, and all of the different parts of Central Europe, that it turned into like a crazy quilt or a checkerboard of countries. And some of them would be Catholic and some of them would be Lutheran. And then, you have variations, but the Peace of Westphalia says, we respect your boundaries and you get to set the religion in your country. So don't try to have a religious war anymore. We're not going to have any more religious wars because we've already decided that these countries are going to be Catholic, these countries are going to be Protestant, and if you don't like it, you can move. Well, that led to the respect for the idea of national sovereignty that lasted until, 300 years, until 1948, when they began the United Nations. For Tony Blair, according to what he says, he was like, oh, I'm just dawdling along in the Treaty of Westphalia world, da ba da ba da, happy, happy. Everybody's understanding, which I did. What did you think about sovereignty? The same thing as Peace of Westphalia, probably. That's your country. You decide the rules. I'm not going to try to tell you the rules in your country, and you better not try to tell me the rules in my country. And that's a general common understanding of sovereignty that we still have. Of course, it's under direct attack right now, isn't it? Well, where does this attack come from but from the intellectual tradition that made a Tony Blair? And that involves the Rhodes scholarships, Oxford, and it also involves Harvard, and it also involves a group called the Agrarians, which is a Southern writers group in the between the wars area that we'll be studying about a little bit tonight in this book. The quote from Tony Blair that I read, and some more from tonight's readings, is going to come from this book, New World Order by Sean Stone. The book is 2017, I think. It's very up to date, and I highly recommend it. No, I'm sorry, 2012 with a 2016 edition. Published by Trine Day, and Chris Milligan has written a wonderful publisher's foreword there that really also sets the stage for understanding this the current state of world geopolitics. And I have to compliment Sean Stone on this book. It really, I endorse it completely. It's a masterpiece of just a few, 200, not even 200 pages, 180 some pages. Really worth it. So, having enjoyed it myself, I wanted to share some of it from you, from as much time as we have. Let me introduce, though, William Elliot from a different source. First of all, I mentioned an organization called the Tennessee Templars. And have you heard of the Tennessee Templars? Let's see if I can get this up on the screen here. I know Andy will help me if I can't get it. Andy's here tonight, by the way, everybody. Hooray! Round of applause for Andy. Yeah, all right. All right, go back.
You need help, Chad?
Go back to sleep, Andy. You need some rest, buddy. Oh boy. All right, let's see if we can get this thing up here. Okay, did that work, Andy? Have we got the Tennessee Knights Templar from Nashville?
It's all good.
Okay, so here's what this is. This is the Nashville history site, Tennessee Knights Templar. These are the famous Tennessee Templars, from a book published in 1883, a register of names with biographical sketches of the Knights Templar of Tennessee, and brief histories of the grand and subordinate commanderies by James Daniel Richardson, Nashville, published in 1883. And we just scroll through them, and you can see, oh, this one's a cotton factor and a banker, civil engineer, master mason, merchant, photographer. And, well, these are people that have joined the Templars, the Knights Templar in Tennessee. And of course, these are going to be Confederates. But I just wanted to show you this. This is, in fact, when I get to the E's, you'll see. Okay, here we are. Elliot William Yandell, merchant, born Rutherford County, November 2nd, 1827. Master mason, Moriah Lodge, June 12th, 1850. Royal Arch Mason, Pythagoras Chapter 23, 1852. Knight Templar, Nashville Commandery 1, admitted to Murfreesboro Commandery 10. May 24th, 1875, joined the Presbyterian Church, member lower of House of Tennessee Legislature in 1865 to 6, a pension agent in Nashville. Okay, so who is he? He is William Yandell Elliot, the writer's grandfather. So our man, William Yandell Elliot, and I'm once again going to share something from Executive Intelligence Review, this from their volume of January 25th, 2002. And once again, very grateful to the LaRouche Pub website, larouchepub.com, where we can enjoy these great old entries. And let's read this one about the subject of our show tonight, William Yandell Elliot. Oh, and why is he important? Let me come back and explain quickly that he's important because he became the head of the government department at Harvard. Yeah, the head of the government department at Harvard. He comes from Tennessee. And why? Why does Harvard want this guy from Tennessee? Well, that's part of the answer to the question tonight. So let's read some about William Yandell Elliot. Born 1896 in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. Died on January 1979 in Virginia. Family, William Yandell Elliot was the third by that name in a line of Tennessee Templars, closely associated with the Masonic founders of the post-Civil War Ku Klux Klan. His grandfather was a Reconstruction-era radical Republican legislator who was reported to have provoked deadly racial violence. This provocateur charge against the first William Yandell Elliot is supported by the fact that, although ostensibly an anti-slavery Republican, he served under the Masonic command of Ku Klux Klan founding member James Daniel Richardson. That's the man who authored the book in 1883, by the way, who, as a congressman in 1898, led the campaign for the construction of a memorial to Klan founder Albert Pike in the nation's capital. Now, you and I, we've talked about that Albert Pike statue many times. There's William Yandell Elliot with a picture with, of course, President Richard Nixon. And in Sean Stone's book, you'll see a picture of him with just about every president in living memory up until he died in 1979. You can see there he's associated with Kissinger. He's also associated with Bertrand Russell, one of the most evil characters ever to walk the earth. A number of shady characters, of course, that he was hanging out with. And there's a picture of Sean Stone there in the gallery. All right, so let's get back to where I was. I was reading more. I'm going to go ahead and read some more about William Yandell Elliot from this article, and we'll let Andy go ahead and fill in if he has any graphics. He was educated at Webb School in Bell Buckle, Tennessee, at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, where he got a BA in 1917, Masters of Arts in 1920, and here we go, Balliol College, Oxford University, London, England, a Rhodes Scholar, PhD in 1923. So, this man from the heritage of the Ku Klux Klan, of the Southern aristocracy, goes to Vanderbilt, gets a master's at Vanderbilt, and gets a Rhodes Scholarship and goes to Balliol College in Oxford University. Elliot's entire career was dedicated to establishing a new dark age of globally extended medieval feudalism built on the ruined remains of the United States and any nation which strove to establish itself on any approximation of American principles. Well, this is the Executive Intelligence Review, telling it like it is. From the Freemasonic elite of Murfreesboro, Tennessee, Elliot went on to play a major role in shaping the Cold War predecessor to today's clash of civilizations, strategic policy from the period preceding World War II through at least the Johnson administration. Despite his occasional colorful utterances of loyalty to the United States, he insisted throughout that the real enemy in the Cold War was not communism, but American style nationalism. Sounds kind of like Joe Biden in a way. Beyond his role in strategic policy, he was an FBI informant and promoted anti communist education in the public schools. In the 1930s, he pointed out that left wing socialists were among the first to recognize the danger of communism. And later, in the 1950s and 60s, he collaborated with leading socialists, including Sidney Hook and James Burnham, in the anti communist crusade. He served as advisor to at least 5 presidential administrations, was mentor to at least 5 national security advisors, the patron of 2 secretaries of state, and educator of dozens of officials, including parliamentary representatives, administrators, and heads of state from countries on every inhabited continent. Throughout his career, he coordinated operations between his hometown crowd, the Tennessee Templar heirs of the Ku Klux Klan, and the Cecil Rhodes Roundtable movement, with which he became associated during his Rhodes Scholarship studies at Britain's Balliol College at Oxford University. His speeches, published work, and private correspondence emphasize that he viewed his life's work as extending the Round Table movement worldwide. His direction of the Harvard Summer School, including Henry Kissinger's International Seminar and the International Seminar Alumni Associations, which it spawned around the world, were all directed at this purpose. The affinity between the Round Tablers and the fugitives is indicated by the fact that the fugitive, John Crow Ransom, the grandnephew of Ku Klux Klan founder James R. Crow, preceded Elliot as a Rhodes Scholar. Fugitive and Templar Bill Frierson accompanied him, and fugitive Robert Penn Warren succeeded him. Well, the article goes on, but his his character was put so well in that one sentence that I feel like I don't already really need to read the rest of it. Eliot's entire career was dedicated to establishing a new dark age of globally extended medieval feudalism built on the ruined remains of the United States and any nation which strove to establish itself on any approximation of American principles. Well, there you go. I'm going to pick a chapter out of Sean Stone's book, The New World Order, and sorry, find my page. There's a great chapter. The first chapter is the Rhodes Scholarship for Imperialism. And that's what these guys have done. They've gone and they've gotten themselves brainwashed into Rhodes's round table principles. And the idea, of course, is that in lieu of the Peace of Westphalia and the national sovereignty, which of course that's the basis of the United States, sovereignty and peace. to achieve what they want, this rules-based order, they have to set aside all of that, all the nationalism, all of the respect for boundaries, all the respect for another country's right to be different, and the rights of the individuals fall along with those of the sovereignty of the nations, of course. That is what, I'm frankly, I'm frightened of. I'm frightened of this totalitarian blanket that's descending upon us like a new iron curtain. Only instead of an iron curtain, it's an iron dome. So what they want to do is divide us into groups, and that is what they do with um, balkanization. The idea of taking a big country like Hungarian Empire and turn it into a bunch of little states, but that at least that those little states have got something in common internally that's going to bind them together. And that's where we get to sectionalism and the division of the United States into sections, which is divide and conquer, obvious. So I'm going to read some chapter 3 here from Sean Stone's book, New World Order. I'm on page 33. Political sectionalism in America between the wars. Before Oxford, Elliot's years as an undergraduate at Vanderbilt University were spent discussing philosophy and poetry with a group of young men who became recognized in the 1930s as agrarians. In the late 1910s, through, John Crow Ransom, Alan Tate, Donald Davidson, Elliot, and later Robert Penn Warren were known for their poetry journal, The Fugitive. Although Elliot never adopted the mantle of agrarianism, he maintained an affinity for his student friends' movement and remained close to them throughout his life. In 1930, the agrarian writer Alan Tate noted in the New Republic that the words sectionalism and regionalism were appearing in almost every essay on the relation of literature to American society that I have read in the last 3 years. Tate would have respected this phenomenon, for over the previous decade, he and his fellow fugitive poets had been attempting to rekindle a uniquely Southern literary tradition through their publication. By 1928, John Crow Ransom and Tate had begun to broaden their political horizons by preparing a polemic with some of the former fugitives called I'll Take My Stand. This book, 1930, made up of 12 essays by the self-proclaimed Southern agrarians, was intended to promote the idea of agrarian versus industrial. The agrarians believed that the Southern way of life, culturally as well as economically, would be swallowed up by the industrialization of the North, even its agricultural production, in which the South's rural lands specialized. In many ways, the agrarians' emphasis on self-sufficient production and ending industrial capitalism's unrelenting war on nature, quote unquote, prefigured the environmental movement of the 1960s and 70s. According to critic William Tucker, this book, quote, is often cited as one of the most quixotic episodes in American literary history. The effort of a small group of Southern academics to resurrect a romanticized antebellum South. Yeah, they're not just whistling Dixie. They excoriated the efforts of science and scorned the fruits of technology. Indoor plumbing, farm machinery, and paved roads, they said, were only the manacles of an encroaching industrial misery. Maybe they were right in a way, but I don't think it means we need to go back to medieval feudalism. Yet the agrarians' movement claims movement's claims of a culturally distinct and land-oriented Southern tradition were also steeped in Anglophile influences. Notice when they say land-oriented and think about blood and soil, right? Just, just a footnote. In I'll Take My Stand, the agrarian leader Ransom, himself a Rhodes Scholar of 1913, was not shy about announcing, quote, the Anglophile sentiment in the South, which derived its desire for fixed traditions and socio-economic order from England's, quote, seasoned provincial life. The South that Ransom and his fellow agrarians romanticized and wished to preserve had aristocracy, a kind of serfdom, a ritualized religion. In short, it was a stable, organic, and spiritually unified society like the Middle Ages. There you go. That's a great picture there, Andy. Yeah, I guess the cotton fields there, and then back in the back, there's some industry going on. The Victorian medievalists like Thomas Carlyle and John Ruskin, who preferred feudalism's pre-industrialism, served as ideological parents for the agrarians. To Ransom in particular, the medievalists fear that industrialized society's theory of scientific and economic progress would destroy the social and aesthetic fabric of pre-industrial communities, had been realized with almost fatal completeness in America. Yet the agrarian search for tradition did not end with the Victorians, for they had a more modern inspiration from the English poet T.S. Eliot, whose own articulation of, quote, the proper Christian community rejected the presence of Negroes and Jews because they divided the monolithic social unity, quote, unquote. If William Yandell Elliot's co-organic community depended upon a community shared value system, it could have been conceivably construed to permit the exclusion of those who did not fit per the morality of the community. Some of the agrarians, like Ransom and Tate, seem to have imbibed in this cultural relativism in order to adopt, quote, the feeling of the community in which you lived. Consequently, the import of regionalism or sectionalism was that it allowed for the socioeconomic integrity of communities, the sum of which defined a region. In 1935, Elliot, then a professor of government at Harvard, wrote a justification of the New Deal in his book, The Need for Constitutional Reform. The book advocated a centralization of authority in the hands of the executive. But in terms of the federal system as a whole, he paradoxically hoped that the states would be redistributed as commonwealths. These regional commonwealths were in fact envisioned as a means of centralizing administrative bureaucracy in order to streamline the number of functions of local and county government areas. Eliot proposed that states be replaced by a, quote, natural regions like New England, New York, the South Atlantic seaboard, the lower Mississippi Valley, the Pacific coast, etc., each with its own legislature. The Commonwealth should have the duty of carrying out federal laws, as the provinces have in Canada. But the 50 states would then remain more as a localized administrative unit. I'm going to move forward to Chapter 7, Order Out of Chaos, Initiating the Cold War. And by the way, he's written a very excellent chapter on World War II, how it got started, and what the New World Order's seeds that are already planted before the war. Again, an excellent read. How many times have I read this quote to you? If you've been with me a while, you can probably almost read it with me, but here it shows up once again in a book that I've chosen. This one is the quote from George Kennan, which reads as this: We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity without positive detriment to our national security. To do so, we will have to dispense with all sentimentality and daydreaming, and our attention will have to be concentrated everywhere on our immediate national objectives. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction. George F. Kennan, 1948. There you have it, 300 years from 1648. And George F. Kennan basically says it. We are the special people. We are the 6% that get everything. Well, that was what he sold to the nation as the necessary policy, out of which came Kissinger and his NSSM 200, with the same principle applied to food and famine and starvation, and using food as one of those non-altruistic weapons that I think these folks from Yandell, Elliot to George Kennan to Henry Kissinger and how many more? Hillary Clinton, we could keep go on and on. That is their idea, is that we're going to use whatever it takes to maintain our hegemonic control over the resources of the planet. As far back as 1931, 15 years before the Cold War, William Yandell Elliot viewed the chief disturbance to the security of international order as coming from Russia. Russia is potentially threatening to the structure of the capitalist world economy, in which the City of London shares with New York the ruling position. As long as capitalist nations avoid war, the threat is slight. Yet the capitalist nations did not avoid war, and in 1945, Western Europe was left in shambles, with the Russian military stretched from Germany to Yugoslavia. Meanwhile, the United States demobilized. While there were still hopes that Russia would agree to the Yalta agreements and permit free elections in Poland and other East European countries. Instead, the defeat of the Communist parties in Austria and Hungary in 1945 proved to the Soviets that these neighbors could not be both friendly to Russia and democratic at the same time. Between 1945 and 48, when Czechoslovakia's government was overthrown by the Communist Party, the Soviets consolidated an autocratic Eastern Bloc from East Germany to Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, and Hungary. When the anti-monarchist communist guerrillas began revolutionary activity in Greece in 1946, they sought sanctuary in Soviet-allied Albania. In neighboring Turkey, Russia had already rekindled its aspirations for warm water ports, demanding northeastern territory from Turkey in 1945. When the British threatened to withdraw their troops entirely from Greece and Turkey in 1947, they forced America to take their place, precipitating the Truman Doctrine of March 12th, which enunciated a proactive American policy of containment and maintaining the status quo by, quote, supporting free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. The Truman Doctrine led to immediate congressional budgetary approval of military aid to both Greece and Turkey. Samuel P. Huntington, a political analyst and former student of Elliot, commented in a 1981 discussion when reflecting upon the lessons of Vietnam about, quote, an additional problem for decision makers who want to intervene or take some action. He noted, You may have to sell it in such a way as to create the misimpression that it is the Soviet Union that you are fighting. That is what the United States has been doing ever since the Truman Doctrine. The Cold War truly began in this period, especially once the Soviets rejected the extension of Marshall Plan aid that summer, denying American capitalism a hand in the development and probably the reshaping of the closed Soviet economic system. With the loss of Eastern Europe, America and England were now limited in their world order to the British Commonwealth and Western Europe. This was codified in 1949. Canada, France, Italy, and 7 other European nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization as a mutual defense or collective security corollary to the League of Nations, promising to safeguard the freedom, common heritage, and civilization of their peoples, founded on principles of democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law, unquote. In effect, the Cold War was a battle to ensure that the Anglo American world order would extend this model of international obligations and law internationally. At the outbreak of World War II, internationalists like William Yandell Elliot's mentor at Oxford, A.D. Lindsay, portended that a stronger international body should replace the corrupted League of Nations system of conferences with enforceable powers of governance. In January of 1940, while Britain remained complacent in the face of Poland's dissolution, Lindsay declared at Oxford the need for another war to end all wars. In contrast to the Chamberlain government's fear of German gas attacks and the German military's ability to decimate London in a day, Lindsay argued for war, despite the failure of the First World War to end war. In words reminiscent of the Round Table, Lindsay proposed that this new generation could end war entirely by realizing, quote, the necessity of extending to a world society the principles of law which we have learned to maintain within the state. By normalizing a system of law and applied government action on an international rather than a national scale, Lindsay proposed Lindsay believed that the nations could learn to see themselves as cohesively unified enough to deem all wars as civil wars, a concept which had become anathema to modern nations. Of course, Lindsay expected that the smaller states could retain their cultural independence, but in order to avoid the struggle for economic self sufficiency between the world powers, as was then taking place in nationalist Germany and Japan, the nations would have to join a world economy which necessitated world law. Although this international order might ultimately be deemed a world government, in the meantime, the supranational order and sovereignty of mankind was still obstructed by the concept of the nation state. The means for achieving this superstructure were illuminated in The City of Man by the City of Man's authors in 1940 as constitutional order, ethico religious purpose, and economic justice inside the single communities that must build it. This endeavor would thus require the cultivation of the communities or nations toward agreement. In order to mask the coercion necessary to cultivate a consensus among the international community, the Council on Foreign Relations leaders realized by 1942 that America could avoid the onus of big power imperialism in its implementation of the grand area that was their idea of British Commonwealth, US, China, and Japan, and creation of one open door world by creating a power international in character through a United Nations body. And so from there, we go to the John Foster Dulles State Department saying that the Soviet Union is impossible to negotiate with. They want to take over the whole world. They are, you know, uh, they're insinuating into our they're spies. They're into, the whole idea of you can't negotiate with them and you can't stand in the middle. There's no third way. There's no you can't you have to be on our side. You're either on our side or you're with the communists because you'll fall to communism if you don't join us. And we're the ones that know what the rules are because it's our rules. It's our new world order. And so we're the ones that tell you what the rules are. My wife and I watched Dr. Strangelove the other night, and it's reminiscent of Elliot. William Yandell Elliot advocated the use of nuclear weapons. Alleging that the Soviets would develop nuclear weapons discreetly behind the Iron Curtain, Elliot urged that America needed to continue testing in order to develop cleaner nuclear weapons, which could be used to fight limited wars and to reduce the threat of human destruction to livable and bearable proportions, quote unquote. I think that this guy, Elliot, may have been Dr. Strangelove because that's what Dr. Strangelove is saying. And of course, that's what uh, George C. Scott and that just was an amazing scene. The general talking about how, um, hey, we might as well do it because we'll only lose maybe 10 or 20 million people. We can wipe out the Soviets, but hey, we'll still be fine. Willing to take on a. There he is. Go ahead and put him up there, Andy. Uh, yeah, there's Dr. Strangelove, and th- this is the mentality. It is the mentality of we're going to do whatever it takes to impose our rules-based order upon the entire world, even if we have to kill 20 million of our own people. Yeah. So Sean Stone's book goes on into the era of Kissinger, chapter 8, Kissinger's Understanding of History, the End of the Cold War. Here's a quote from Henry Kissinger, 1982, speaking to the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which, of course, is the Chatham House, the think tank of all think tanks uh, in London. This is Kissinger. Quote, "It was therefore a rude awakening when in the 1960s and 70s the United States became conscious of the limits of even its resources. Now, with a little over a fifth of the world's GNP, America was powerful but no longer dominant. Vietnam was the trauma and the catharsis, but the recognition was bound to come in any event. Starting in the 70s, for the first time, the United States had to conduct a foreign policy in the sense with which Europeans have always been familiar, as one country among many, unable either to dominate the world or escape from it, with the necessity of accommodation, maneuver, a sensitivity to marginal shifts in the balance of power, an awareness of continuity and of the interconnections between events." William Yandell Elliot had passed away in 1979, but H.G. Wells's open conspiracy was ongoing when Kissinger described the American historical philosophy as fundamentally flawed. To Kissinger, the paradigmatic conflict between the British and American worldviews had been evinced during World War II, when Churchill had hoped to prepare an imperial balance of power to check Russia immediately after the cessation of hostilities in Germany, while Roosevelt, quote, toyed with the idea of non alignment between a balance of power oriented colonialist Britain and an ideologically obstreperous Soviet Union. Essentially, Roosevelt hoped to continue the American tradition of independence of action, to avoid the chicanery of English balance of power politics, which had played one ally enemy against another throughout the 19th century. To Kissinger, the post concert of Europe from 1815 to 1914 was peace for 99 years without a major war. If a century of lesser wars and revolutions can be described as peaceful, it indicates a great deal about Kissinger's understanding of the nature of peace. From there, we go forward into the use of the, the American dollar, the Bretton Woods system, which the American dollar was the dominant currency and really meant something, was used, of course, to export our industries, to buy up things cheaply overseas and export our factories and our technology and everything else until they had done enough. And then in 1971, they, through Nixon, and of course it was our old friend George P. Shultz that engineered it, took the dollar off of the Bretton Woods system and allowed it to float, no longer tied to the value of gold. And that, of course, happened after all of the American corporations had ensured that their wealth was based overseas. So now, who's left but us to do all of the work and pay all the bills? By the end of the 1970s, it appeared that America had followed the British lead to play the part of global banker, utilizing such Machiavellian power politics as described by John Perkins, a self proclaimed economic hitman, when he reflected on his career with the strategic consulting firm Charles T. Main, which advised the World Bank, United Nations, IMF, U.S. Treasury, Fortune 500 corporations, and select countries from the post colonial world in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Quote, first, I was to justify huge international loans that would funnel money back to Maine, that is Charles T. Main, the employer, and other U.S. companies such as Bechtel, Halliburton, Stone and Webster, and Brown and Root through massive engineering and construction projects. Second, I would work to bankrupt the countries that received those loans after they had paid Maine and the other contractors, of course, so that they would be forever beholden to their creditors and would present easy targets when we needed favors, such as military bases, UN votes, or access to oil or other natural resources. Kissinger accurately described America's demoralized condition in 1982 as having come to recognize the tragic. And yet his belief was unshaken that the destiny of man was to continue to overcome the restraints of the nation state by creating a supranational national world order. Kissinger thus gloated in his speech before the RIAA, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, that America had been forced in the years after World War II to accept that it could no longer enjoy its uniquely independent position in world affairs, but was in fact subject to rules of international balance of power and the constraints of supranational order. For Kissinger, America needed to understand what he had come to learn while writing his thesis under the tutelage of William Yandell Elliot, that individuals must, quote, accept constraints on their freedom for the sake of establishing a stable political community, unquote. And so too did nation states. The idea was a continuation of the antipathy felt for the nation state by the Anglophile elites like Elliot, who did not believe that self interested governments could ever compromise to plan the constitutional and economic designs for the theoretical benefit of their world commonwealth. Restraints on individual freedoms brings us right up to the present moment, does it not? So I think what we've seen here is through the character of William Yandell Elliot and the Boston Brahmins and the people that run Harvard, the connection to Oxford and the British Empire and the system of the British ruled order is what it really is. It's the system of, you have Canada, you have Australia. They're not independent, but they're sort of independent. And we would have like the South, and we would have the Mid-Atlantic and the Pacific Coast, and they'd be like provinces. And the states would still be there, but it's just kind of for administrative purposes and colorful flags and stickers and things. Well, that's the British idea, and I think we can trace now from Lord Palmerston right up to the present day through the Tennessee Templars, William Yandell Elliot, the government department at Harvard, teaching Elliot, teaching Kissinger, teaching Brzezinski, teaching Samuelson, teaching all of these other Huntington, I should have said. I'm a little sleepy. All right, so we'll wrap it up here, but that's the story. The whole New World Order explained through the eyes of William Yandell Elliot. Good night, everybody.